Welcome to Wellness and Wisdom with me, Dr. Nadu Tuakli. Here you can expect to hear conversations about everything women over 40 care about. From optimal wellness and peak performance, from intimacy to travel and finances and more. I will be speaking to interesting women and sometimes men to educate and motivate you to live your best life. If you want to find out more, please head over to my website, drtuakli.com, or subscribe to my blog. You can also read my book, Sex, Sanity, and Sleep. We are in this together. Thank you for joining this edition of Wellness and Wisdom with me, Dr. Nadu Tuakli, and Dame Anionwu, PhD, Order of Merit, Dame of the British Empire, CBE, named BBC Woman of the Year in 2020. She also was the recipient of the Pride of Britain Lifetime Achievement Award, presented by Janet Jackson. Dame Anionwu is a retired nurse who epitomizes wellness and wisdom. She documented her life history in her recent book, Dreams from My Mother. Welcome back, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Nadu.
So last time we talked a lot about the coronation, but this episode, I would like to focus on your life in the past and becoming a nurse and your childhood and where you feel you are headed in your fourth quarter. We also, of course, touched on your book. What would you say were the main life lessons from your childhood and when did you learn them?
There were two main lessons. There are very kind people and there are very unkind people. I was fortunate in that the majority of the people I came across in childhood and actually into adulthood are kind people, were kind people, and made up for the negative experiences from the few unkind people that crossed my path, unfortunately.
When everyone looks back, we realize what a vulnerable period childhood is. Unfortunately, you can't take it back or imbibe your younger self with the knowledge that you gained later. What advice would you give to people who had a difficult childhood?
Difficult question to answer, to be very honest, because we only have our own experiences and maybe, but to be fair, I do read a lot of biographies and autobiographies. For me, it has been focusing on the positive experiences that I had. If I can't make sense of the negative ones, to try and park them as best as I can. If I find that I'm getting depressed from thinking back to some aspects of my turbulent childhood, then I realised I have a sort of virtual toolbox that helps me calm me down, think more positively, and balances my mood out. One of the most important ones is friendship and family. There's another significant one is music. Music actually is very, very important to me because I've realised that by having different playlists on my phone, choosing tracks that will lift my spirits if necessary, actually sometimes to calm me down as well, I've really got to know how music does help me a lot.
So what is your earliest memory?
4, maybe. And it was the first children's home I was in. It was a Roman Catholic one, run by nuns. And in this first one, it was for the very small children. And there used to be a balcony or a veranda where cots, children's chairs would be put out. And it seemed like we overlooked a garden, I think. And I just have a memory of being out on that balcony and that it was very sunny and warm. And remembering the nuns wearing either their black or their white habits, sort of floating around. And it's interesting why I remember that, because there's no significant action that took place. Maybe we were there quite a lot, I don't know.
I read in your book that as part of the 2019, while we're speaking about homes, the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, they wrote a report about some of the Nazareth houses where many children were. And you were at Nazareth House, one of them. And they described it as a place of fear, hostility, and confusion, and places where children were physically and emotionally degraded with impunity. They also said that there was sex abuse of kids in some instances, and that children were deprived of compassion, dignity, care, and comfort. So that kind of struck me because, once again, children are so vulnerable. It's a critical age. And there were quite a few Nazareth houses. And clearly, that wasn't the only kind of care home that there was. So one really has to think about a whole generation of people that were impacted by this child abuse. Of course, but in those days, they didn't call it that. Can you tell us about the child migration scheme that happened around
Yes.
that time?
It's interesting. In writing my memoirs, I really explored any books that were written or narratives that were recorded from individuals who lived in a Nazareth house convent, and particularly those that were sent out to places like Australia. It's the scheme that you're referring to. I did come across a man called Barry and discovered that he was actually at the same Nazareth House children's home in Birmingham. And Barry was at this second children's home, and he called it Nazi House, not Nazareth House. And his memories were very, very negative indeed. And whilst I had some negative experiences, I certainly didn't have some of these horrific experiences that we know about. Referring to this scheme, there was a sort of, I don't know whether it was to populate countries like Australia, which had, they were called the New Commonwealth for a start. Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Certainly Australia, I do remember not the child migration scheme, because fortunately I wasn't part of it. And I think it was because of my skin colour, but also it was because Australia had a whites-only policy up until the 70s, I think.
Correct.
The main reason was that my mother did not have me up for adoption. She was determined to make a home for me with her when her circumstances improved. So that's why I stayed in the children's home until I was 9. But the Catholic Church, alongside other religious and other organisations, were part of this scheme that literally transported children out to countries such as Australia. For the narratives I've read and the television programs, the documentaries that I've seen, it seemed a form of slave labour for some children. In other words, there was deceit that was practiced in terms of some mothers didn't know that their biological children, who they had placed in care because of their difficulties, hadn't really given them up. The children were transported to...
And they weren't aware that their children were being shipped out.
No, and they didn't give permission. So there was some horrendous activities going on, definitely. I'm very grateful to my mother and my skin colour that I wasn't caught up in that.
And your skin colour, exactly.
Yes, because interestingly enough, the Catholic official involved was actually the canon who was in touch with my mother's family about my mother's situation and enabling me to go into temporary care. So I was able to get hold of the correspondence from the Nazareth House archives. They sent me a folder of everything. And, my mother and her parents, my grandparents, particularly my grandfather, who was the person communicating initially, he was treated with utmost respect by the canon. So I think there was an issue of class involved. I think there was an issue that here's my mother, a very bright young student at Cambridge University, who got pregnant outside of marriage. But the church rallied round my mother's family. Unlike, we can see the stories, particularly, for example, of Irish girls came over just after the Second World War, which was when I was born. So there were differences in the way individuals and families were treated based on class, financial situation, status. Definitely there were differences. I was in the favoured category, I think, in some respects. Thank goodness I didn't experience some of these negative... I did experience some negative experiences, but nowhere near to the degree that some children going into adulthood from these situations went into.
So you referred to secrets and lies, and clearly a lot of these were perpetrated by the church. I mean, in your situation, they knew who you were, who your parents were, but the secrets obviously was that your mother had the baby and that she put the child in the nursing home. And then your extended family had to pretend that you were not a relative of theirs. So it is a difficult way to grow up surrounded by, as you said before, you don't really know what questions to ask. You don't want to upset anyone. And you were not courageous enough to ask questions of people that were close to you because you were concerned about embarrassing them. But later in life, you describe yourself as someone who liked to stir things up. So what happened?
Well, I always did want to know who my father was. I mean, I don't know what age I realised that I was, first of all, I was different colour, all the children in the children's home. Then I realised when I lived with my mother and stepfather that whilst it started out all right, my father ended up physically abusing me because he was being teased by his mates at the pub, when they were drinking. What's he doing having a half-caste child, which was the terminology used for mixed-race children like myself? What was he doing allowing his woman, so we have the misogynism as well, and what was he allowing his woman to have a half-caste child in his house? So just that, account tells you so many things.
Right.
I was subject to physical abuse by him because he couldn't cope with it. And as a result, my maternal grandparents rescued me when my mother sought help from them. I then went to live with them in the northwest of England until I was 16. I was curious, but, I just sensed that nobody mentioned anything about my father, and obviously started to realise people don't talk about certain things. Not a good idea to ask questions because you don't know. The expression "walking on eggshells" comes to mind. You don't know what you're going to crack open.
Right.
You don't know what you're going to
Mm-hmm.
disturb. And life is very confusing. And as a child, I had to sort of navigate my world through these disparities, which I found very confusing. But I obviously learned one lesson somehow, which was not to rock the boat by asking any questions, even though I was desperate to know the answers.
And there was basically a conspiracy that you couldn't crack through, especially with the nuns who were taking care of you, clearly were not very transparent or giving you much information.
I was only 9 when I left the children's home. And certainly in that era, we're now talking about the 1950s. I can't imagine any nun sitting down with a child and, right, Elizabeth, let's talk about your family. I don't think that would happen. As I said,
Yeah.
because my mother was regularly visiting me, I was never in the group of children that were the other side of the hall on a Sunday for the up for adoption children. I mean, I heard this phrase, up for adoption, and I wouldn't say it was like a
Right.
cattle market. I think that's been too negative. But on a Sunday, children who were up for adoption would be in a different side of the hall to those of us who were not up for adoption. And so I
Not
realised there
paraded.
was this difference. My mother did come regularly to visit me on Sundays and take me out for walks, etc. So I always had the connection with my mother. But I wasn't really clear about what's the difference between me not up for adoption and the other children who are up for it. I didn't understand it. You don't as a
Mm-hmm.
child. And
Right.
I was relatively happy in the children's home. And I know my story does significantly differ from those who have been so traumatized by their experience. I had some negative experiences. There
Right.
were a lot of nuns that I saw as actually humorous, kind, who stood up for me in the event that a particular nun didn't want me to do something, take part in a nursery rhyme event, drama, because I was half caste, and the other nuns argued on my behalf. So I could see, looking back, that I had, what would we call them, allies, champions, whatever. But I didn't know these words then.
Mm-hmm.
I just knew that this nun
Right.
was battling for me and won the argument. And it wasn't until I was 25 I wrote to my mother and asked her for details about my father. Obviously, as I was gradually growing up, I wanted that question answered.
Well, the good thing is that when you asked the question directly, she did answer. Your mom's activities clearly impacted the rest of her family.
They told me this story, but that my mother used to see it because she wasn't allowed to take communion.
Now, speaking of your mother, throughout the book, I feel a lot of sadness for her and the women of that era. She basically missed out on your life. And it shows that even smart women make bad choices. It's sad in the sense of what her situation was, and as a mother, what she went through. But she was so smart, and one would say she's so intelligent. She went to Cambridge, and yet she married a drunk, and she stayed with him. What do you think?
She was like a lioness protecting her cubs. And she stood up for herself against her husband. She didn't allow him to walk all over her, because I was curious as to whether my mother had ever been subjected to physical abuse from my stepfather. My mother told my sister that he tried it once and she just said, look, you tried that again and I'm out of here. She was able to stand up for herself. And I think while she must have regretted the lack of attaining her academic achievements, which she must have wanted to, I think she was very pragmatic in the sense that this is the situation I'm in. My children come first. They always have done. They always will do. And the success of her life was that all five of us, all five of her children, were all very close to her, all loved her dearly. And so she would have had the satisfaction of bringing up children in very difficult situations. And all the children would turned out okay. That's really what I want to say. Difficult issues in their lives that caused them, nobody went to prison, nobody committed suicide. I'm really looking at the very negative aspects that can happen to children from situations that we found ourselves in. She had to work. She always had the children's interest at heart. And some so-called successful women may not have been able to achieve that with their children. So I think this is quite interesting. I would have liked her to have achieved both, her academic career and her maternal career. Because she wanted both, and she only achieved one. But that was significant that she did achieve, because there are some very broken women, aren't there, coming through situations like this. And that wasn't the case for her.
Right.
She was very feisty. She was very obstinate. She was unhappy about not being able to achieve some of her dreams. I'm not trying to, soften the negative aspects of her life at all. But if you look at the wider picture, she didn't end her life on her own, children separated from her, whatever. That wasn't the case.
In your book, you have a lot of sudden departures throughout your life history. Can you tell us about some of them?
It really came to light for me when I got the records from the children's home about my experiences there. I hadn't realised that my mother, she looked after me for 6 months, which was a bit longer than I thought she had. And that was because there was no vacancy, there were no cots available in the children's home at the time. So I lived with her in the mother and baby home for 6 months. And those people who understand about the psychology of bonding will have written about the importance, John Bowlby, for example. So that 6 months, I obviously bonded with my mother. I had that opportunity, although I wasn't aware of it. But then I went into the first children's home, where I was supposed to stay until I was 5. And then I was suddenly moved from that children's home. I was about 3.5, because there was such a demand on the cots. And I was moved to the bigger Nazareth House Children's Home, where I was there until the age of 9. So for me, in terms of childhood, it was that Nazareth House that I considered my home. That's what I remember my early years. And then I went to live with my mother and stepfather from the age of 9, but only for 20 months because of his physical abuse of me and me having to be rescued by my maternal grandparents. And I lived with them until I was 16. I was very close to him. I was close to my grandmother as well, but there was the sadness of his bereavement. But I stayed there until I was 16. Unbeknown to me, my grandmother had promised my mother that she would look after me until I was 16. I didn't know that. I was in what we call sixth form, lower sixth, so I was 16 plus. And I loved school. I had my friends. I loved the teachers. I really got on well there. And suddenly I was sent back to live with my mother and stepfather at 16. That was traumatic, because I felt my world had fallen apart then. My asthma kicked in quite badly. Probably remembering the trauma of when I'd been there 5 years before that. Also, there were very severe smogs at the time. And
that was Wolverhampton, right?
That was Wolverhampton, yes. And I was working as a school nurse assistant because there was no question of me going back to school. I went straight to work. And it didn't bother me too much because I knew I wanted to be a nurse. So I got a job immediately as a school nurse assistant just around the corner where I was living with my mum and stepdad. But my asthma really, really got bad. And I got rescued again, I feel, by the school medical officer of health, who heard about my story through the nurses that I must have disclosed some things to. And he organised me being transferred to work as a residential school nurse assistant in a school, a residential school for delicate children, as they called it in those days. These children who had asthma, mild cerebral palsy, various ailments that it was felt that fresh air and a sheltered experience with a sick bay would help the children. And I had my own bed sit, and I was there till I was 18 and went down to London. So those were the sort of moves that I had up until the age of 16, I would say, 16 to 18, I was settled.
I was reading about your grandmother and how she changed, and it struck me that she seemed to be succumbing to menopause. Back then, it was called melancholia.
Oh,
And of
interesting.
course, nobody really identified what the issue was. But I noticed that your grandmother really changed
Yes, she did.
around the time that your grandfather died.
That's true.
I just read the symptoms and how you
Mm,
described it, and I said, okay,
oh, that's interesting.
menopause strikes
Yes,
again.
yes, I wondered because I felt she
So,
was
how did you
depressed.
become
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Uh huh. Uh huh. No, I was saying, how did you become a nurse after leaving school?
So I couldn't start my nurse training until I was 18, and I always wanted to go to London, as youngsters did then, the bright lights of London, although I was very, very shy. And I got, I applied actually to 3 teaching hospitals when I was working as a school nurse assistant in the Midlands. All of them wanted a photograph of me. They also wanted to know my father's name and occupation, which I didn't know because I had my mother's maiden name. And I never heard from any of these teaching hospitals. And the medical officer of health, he was so angry. Initially, I thought he was angry with me. He said, no, it's not you. It's those wretched teaching hospitals. You'd make a wonderful nurse. You're very bright. I don't know what's the matter with them. And he gave me the details of Paddington General Hospital. And I applied there and I remember going for an interview with my mom in those days. So it was quite interesting. Anyway, they accepted me onto the course. So at 18, I started. I did the 3-year, what was called state registration nurse course. I loved it. I really enjoyed. Yeah. Although my life was slightly upside down, I think one thing that helped me was that from the age of 16, I had to become independent. I mean, I had people that kept an eye on me and could see something in me. So I wasn't isolated, but I wasn't in a family. I wasn't in a normal family situation, put it that way. But I think it made me grow up quite quickly. I was always able to make friends quite easily, which has always helped me throughout my life. That was a huge help. And looking back, I realised my intelligence has helped me as well. So I've definitely got the genes from my mum and dad. So I didn't realise it at the time
Yeah, I was going to
because,
say, you seem to be pretty focused.
yeah, I always wanted to be
Your
a nurse.
focus seemed to be
Yeah,
real helpful. Yes.
I agree. I agree.
You had something and you had an ambition,
Yes,
and
and I
that
couldn't be
helps.
swayed from that ambition because I remember when I was at school, it was clear that some of the teachers saw me as quite bright, and in those days, nursing wasn't in the university sector in England. It was adjacent to the hospital. You'd have a school of nursing linked with the hospital. And they were telling me, you're university material. I remember that was the phrase I had, you're university material, isn't it? And I was also becoming quite good at keeping on board people who I knew saw something in me, inwardly obstinate about the decision I'd already made, which was to become a nurse. So I said, oh, okay. But knowing actually, I'm going to do nursing, which is what I did. And interestingly, of course, now nursing is based in the university, so there wouldn't be any issues about that at all.
Now, what triggered your interest in sickle cell disease?
I call it the 3 Ps. The 3 Ps stand for personal, professional, and political. So the personal, I found my father in 1972 when I was 25. I then met my Nigerian family and I discovered I had a cousin who had sickle cell anemia. He actually he was living in England, and lovely, 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 lovely man. And he lived actually into his early 60s, which, was good in those days to survive until then.
Very good for sickle cell.
Very
Even
good, yes.
till today.
Yes, yes. The professional was that when I was a health visitor, and this was around the time I met my father in the early 1970s, I was working in Brent in northwest London, and I met families who had children with the condition. I had never been taught about the illness in my nurse training in Paddington or my health visiting training in West London in the early 70s. So I got very angry about this, actually. I wasn't professionally equipped to help parents when they asked for my advice and support. I didn't know what this illness was. And I was becoming more aware of being a black woman and a black health professional and thinking, hold on, why is this illness not covered in the curriculum? You know, this is racism. This is an example of health inequalities, both in the curriculum and in practice to some extent. So that spurred me on. So we're talking about, and that brought in the political. There was the personal, professional, and political. I was taught, quite rightly, I was taught about cystic fibrosis. It is a serious inherited illness, mainly of white people. But there were actually more cases of sickle cell disease in Britain than there were of cystic fibrosis. Something, can't argue that you weren't taught about it, Elizabeth, because, you know, so few people have it. That isn't the case. There's more people that have this condition than the condition I was taught about. So it doesn't make sense. I was starting to become quite a radical person in the sense that I joined a political party. I was very interested in the impact of race on my own sense of well-being and identity. So there were all these things all going on at the same time. Looking back, that is why I got involved with sickle cell, and all those factors. And it wasn't until the late 70s that I was then a community nurse tutor based in northwest London with an office at a hospital where a new haematologist called Dr. Brozovic, who sadly recently died, she realised that sickle cell was a very important issue for this hospital and realised that the professionals didn't know much about it. The patients weren't being given enough support. So she started to give a couple of lectures. I went to both. I thought, oh, great, somebody talking about sickle cell at last, you know. I asked loads of questions
Right.
after each session. And she came running up to me after the second session. You seem interested in this. And she realised that when we started talking, and she realised I was a health visitor and I was very community-based, really got me involved. And I also started going to the United States and for holidays, because I had Nigerian family out there. But I realised then sickle cell was a big issue in America. The civil rights activism had incorporated sickle cell alongside lead poisoning and iron deficiency anemia and other conditions that impacted on the black community in particular, and had
Right.
raised the profile and lobbied for whatever, so much so that a sickle cell act was passed in the early 1970s. So there was all this going on, which I wasn't aware of, obviously, straight away. But when I went to the States, interested in sickle, saw what was going on in America, and actually then met up with sickle cell nurse specialists. They're all African-American. And they took me under their wing. And I went back and said to Dr. Boswell, you know, there's nurses can get involved with this. They can specialise. So she supported me becoming involved and raised the funds, or got hold of funds to pay my salary initially. So, you know, it wasn't me doing anything on my own. It was very much linked in with people like Dr. Brozovic and me getting involved, listening to those who had sickle cell anemia, with others setting up the Sickle Cell Society, the charity, the national charity that now exists for the condition.
Uh-huh.
So I was getting information from all sources, which was very important for me to learn, actually, this is a neglected issue in this country. And a whole heap of us, including those affected by the condition, started campaigning for better services.
So you became the first official sickle cell nurse in the United Kingdom.
That's right, in
And
1979.
sickle
Yes.
cell awareness is obviously 1979.
Yes.
Sickle cell awareness is obviously much higher now, thanks to your pioneering work. And I believe, as we do in the US, all newborns are screened for sickle cell now.
That's
Is that
correct.
true?
That's correct. That took a lot of
Yeah.
campaigning, and particularly to achieve the knowledge that sickle cell does not just only affect black people. We have screening for babies of all ethnic origin. I would see that as quite revolutionary. That was a big achievement of all the people that campaigned. I mean, it came from everywhere: politicians, health professionals, primarily from those affected by sickle cell and those involved with the Sickle Cell Society. It was a big campaigning issue.
So life expectancy in sickle cell patients now is about 59. How old is the oldest sickle cell patient that you can remember
Oh, I'm aware of people
or
that
that you know now?
are living into their 70s and 80s now. Of course, there are different types of sickle cell disease, and some of them are more milder than others.
Correct.
But when we're talking about sickle cell anemia, the classic one, which is generally more severe,
The
there are
classic.
individuals with that condition who I'm aware have reached, certainly into their 60s and 70s. A small minority, but it's growing because obviously services are much better now for children and young adults, so people are receiving more knowledgeable care than they did historically.
So, for our listeners who don't know what sickle cell disease is, it's an inherited blood disorder where the cells sickle and become rigid and don't carry as much oxygen, or as long, they don't last as long as normal red cells in people who don't have the condition. And it's also a very painful condition because the lack of oxygen in different organs causes what we call infarction, which is where the organs can die or the blood vessels constrict because they're clogged up with the sickle cell cells. And the sickle cell cells, instead of being round like regular blood cells that can go through the vessel and adjust their shape, the sickle cells are rigid and they're in the shape of a sickle, and that's why it's called sickle cell. It's a very chronic disease, but they've made wonderful progress now, and there's even stem cell transplants that can be done, which looks very, very promising. But up until now, sickle cell is something that cannot be quote unquote cured, but it definitely can be managed. And thanks to the work of people like Dame Elizabeth here, much more money has gone into research and coming up with different treatments. So we actually have medications that people can take now. What do you think was the most influential decade of your life that made you who you
Uh,
are now?
Definitely the 1970s, because for me personally, it was when I met my father. I had a loving mother to get it all sorted out in terms of my identity. I call it the missing pieces of my jigsaw. So once I had and also I got on well with my father. I only knew him for 8 years before he died, but it was a wonderful 8 years. And I started going to visit Nigeria and met all my extended family that were both in this country and obviously in Nigeria. It was, so from a personal and professional point of view, the 70s were good, really good for me actually, and steered me into the activities that I eventually specialised in, yes.
I know that I went through a very radical phase in my 20s and 30s, but time has a way of mellowing us out. Although I must say, I still admire Angela Davis. Were you ever political?
I've always been political, but I think I was certainly more radical in my younger days. I think that's normal. I still get angry about issues. I'm not scared to vent my anger if I want to. I had more energy in my younger days. I think one of my chapters in my book is called A Radical Health Visitor, or Becoming a Radical Health Visitor, I can't remember.
Mm-hmm.
So the 70s and 80s, there's a lot, and also there was
Mm-hmm.
so much going on politically, both in
True.
the United States, which influenced me, of course, the civil rights movement in the 60s in the United States, and it hit us over here more in the 70s and 80s. I was actively involved in certain aspects of political campaigns and knew the worth of knowing politicians, briefing politicians. They just need a few sentences. You really have to keep it simple. Not because they're thick, don't get me wrong, but they have a lot of issues. You have to capture their attention
Love to.
and you have to make them feel that you're not asking them to do too many things. You focus, you prioritize. I mean, I learned an awful lot actually from politicians. I learned a lot from my visits to the United States and what happened with the sickle cell movement there. That they taught me a huge amount,
Right.
and I was able to bring back some of those lessons and share them with others. And there were people in this country who helped me as well. So it wasn't all from the States, but it did help me enormously.
Right. As you get older, I guess you figure out that there's more than one way to skin a cat,
That's what they
and
say,
you
yes.
can fight battles sometimes a little more effectively than being a total radical. Would you agree with that?
I think there's different ways of being radical. You can be a very quiet radical because you can do stuff behind the scenes that is radical, but people don't know that you're doing this. Or you could be on the streets marching. You could do both, of course. So, I have done my marches. It's now my daughter and granddaughter that my 15-year-old granddaughter's been on a march so yeah, it is the younger generation. That doesn't mean to say that the older generation can't still be radical in the way,
Can't still
even though it's
contribute.
different. They contribute from their experience
Yes.
and their support, because of course, if you're financially better off, not everybody is, but if you are,
Correct.
you can financially support campaigns in a way that you couldn't do when you were young and poor. So I think, and also, of course, you're supporting younger people. Some people might call it mentoring or whatever. And you can give your voice to campaigns. You don't have to be on the streets, but you can tweet your support for something. For example, I did that as an example. Or if you wish to appear in an interview. So, for example, I still support the fact that nurses in this country need better pay. And I'm not scared of saying that. I think there has to be a recognition as you get older, you do get tired, and the energy is not there in the way that it used to be. And also the fact that I'm not working. I do feel that people involved with situations really should be out there, if they can be. It's their situation, but you can provide support.
So what is next for Dame Elizabeth? You have almost every award one can think of. What are your plans for your fourth quarter?
When I was younger, and I think it's still the case, people would be asked what was their 5-year plan or what was their 10-year plan. I never had forward plans like that. In my 70s, I relax more. What's happening more now, I'm not proactive, I react. So I get invited to be involved or to speak. Basically, I'm deciding what I say yes to and what I say no to. That's the change in my way of life, I've noticed.
Well, I'm touched you said yes to me.
Oh, of course I said yes. It's an honour. It's a huge honour.
I really appreciate it.
I learn so much from all of this as well. It's a different way of learning now, from individuals chatting with me, questioning me, commenting. I find that very stimulating. And I feel lucky because I never felt that I'm isolated, or even during the pandemic, with all the online stuff. And I quite like online activities. So, I just feel I'm very lucky that I've got my family and friends, that I'm still invited to participate in various activities. As I've said, which I can say yes, no, or not too sure about that.
So, do you ever still feel like an outsider? Are there times when you feel like an outsider? Like maybe at a coronation or anything?
No, I didn't feel outside
Just
at the coronation. I just thought it was surreal. I decided I would enjoy something that was so unexpected. I mean, society hasn't changed, but society has changed in some ways for the better, but in some ways not changed. I mean, racism is still there. There is still, some people seem to need to look down on other people for whatever reason. And I'm just sad that that's never going to change. What has to change, or what does change occasionally, is how those isms dealt with, but they'll always be there. And when I've said this, sometimes people go, Elizabeth, that's really quite pessimistic. I said, no, it's real, that's life. I'm not saying be overcome by them, of course not. There's something in the nature of human beings.
yes.
I'm not saying all of them.
No, but I mean, even within the same country, people will find reasons to, even the same race. You found it in Ireland, right? Oh, he's Protestant, she's Catholic. Every time there's a war, an internal war, civil war, it's because one tribe is fighting with the other tribe.
Exactly.
And it's because the human race cannot see everyone as equal. And just like me, people are always looking for differences.
Yes.
So as you said, they can feel superior or better. And you see it all over the world.
Exactly.
All over the world.
I agree.
mean, think about the caste system in India. Is that ever going to change, really? Well, you definitely were the right person to come on my podcast.
Well,
and I
thank
love
you
having
for
you
inviting
here.
me. It's lovely to have been invited. It really
As
has
always,
been lovely.
it's a pleasure to speak with you. And for those of you who'd like to read Dame Elizabeth's book, it's called Dreams from My Mother, and you can get it online, audio, bookstores, all over. And thank you so much once again for coming on to my podcast. Love talking with you, and I wish you all the best. And thank you so much for what you did for elevating sickle cell in the United Kingdom, because it does affect millions of people throughout the world, not just in the UK. And I feel like the work that is done in the West for this condition is going to help people all over the world who don't have the resources to do the research that's necessary. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Nadu, for the invitation. Very honoured indeed. Thank you. And I've enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening to Wellness and Wisdom with me, Dr. Nadu Tuakli. If you want to find out more information, head over to drtuakli.com or subscribe to my blog. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please click the follow button on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with a friend. Wishing you the best of health and happiness. We're in this together. Until next time, stay well.